It started on a cool fall morning, the kind of morning where the sunlight breaks through the mist slowly, gently, and the streets of Brookridge, a sleepy southern town with more churches than traffic lights, were still quiet, save for the occasional jogger or delivery van making its early rounds. Retired U.S. Army General Elijah Cole, a man of measured steps and deliberate silence, stepped out of his modest single-story home on Maple Avenue, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that fit like armor, polished shoes that still gleamed with military precision, and a lapel pin of the American flag pinned just above the heart. His stance straight as a rifle, shoulders broad and high, his cane barely tapping the ground as he made his way to his vintage, yet immaculate dark green Ford F-150. That truck, like him, had seen many roads, heard many stories, and carried weight far beyond appearances. Elijah was on his way to the local Veterans Center, where he mentored troubled youth and young recruits, giving them guidance not just on military life, but on life itself, discipline, honor, perseverance, service. He had done it every Friday for the last 5 years since retirement, and every time he carried with him the weight of memory, war zones, fallen friends, silent prayers before combat, medals received under the heavy eyes of presidents and commands, given that had changed the course of missions and lives. As he turned onto Cypress Avenue, approaching the familiar four-way stop, he noticed a black and white patrol car idling under the shadow of a large oak tree on the corner. Nothing unusual. He came to a complete stop, waited, looked left and right twice, then slowly proceeded to turn left. But within seconds, a high-pitched whoop of the siren broke the morning stillness, and the cruiser shot forward, lights flashing, tires crunching dry leaves as it pulled up behind Elijah's truck. Elijah signaled, pulled over calmly, rolled down the window and waited. A young white officer, Darren Keene, probably early 30s, buzzed with misplaced confidence, hopped out of the car, adjusting his belt and flicking his sunglasses down like he was preparing for a scene in a movie. He approached the window without a word of greeting, tapping on the glass with a knuckle like Elijah was late to answer a door. "License and registration, old man," he said casually, with a tone that sounded less like procedure and more like a warning. Elijah, ever composed, nodded and passed the documents over without a fuss. Keene barely glanced at them before glancing back at Elijah, then down again, his brow arching. "You ran that stop sign," he announced flatly. Elijah raised an eyebrow slightly. "Officer, with respect, I came to a full stop. You were right there." Keene chuckled dryly, his smirk twisting. "Don't argue. I saw what I saw. Don't try to play smart with me. Just another old guy trying to act important." Elijah said nothing. He knew the type. He'd seen boys like this, power-hungry with no war to fight and no wisdom to understand the fight inside. Keene scribbled on his pad with dramatic strokes, then ripped the ticket off and tacked on a secondary citation, failure to comply. "Here," he said, shoving it through the window. "You can try and fight it if you want, but judges in this town listen to officers, not civilians." The disrespect wasn't just in the words. It was in the way Keene held himself, the tilt of his chin, the sneer he didn't bother to hide, the way his hand hovered near his belt like he was ready for conflict. Elijah stared at him calmly, then took the citation. "Thank you," he said softly. Keene turned to leave, but then paused, chuckled again, and added, almost as a taunt, "Bet you don't fight back in court either. You'll just pay it and walk away like the rest of your kind." Elijah's eyes, steely and quiet, locked onto his. There was no anger, no heat, only gravity. "You'll see," he said, and Keene walked away, never knowing that in a single phrase he had poked a sleeping lion. Elijah drove on, not shaking, not ranting. He'd learned long ago how to contain the storm, but he began planning, not for revenge, for revelation. That night, in his study, surrounded by framed commendations, photographs of him with Presidents Clinton, Bush, and Obama, and unit patches from Delta Force, 75th Ranger Regiment, and Army Intelligence, Elijah placed a call to Fort Bragg. "Daniels," he said into the line, "General Cole here. I need a favor, a small one." The next day he called his lawyer, a a young black woman named Nadia Lee who had grown up in Brookridge and returned after graduating with top honors from Columbia Law. "I want to contest this ticket," he told her. "And I want everything on the record," she agreed instantly. "What's the play, sir?" she asked. Elijah chuckled gently. "The truth, Nadia. The truth will be enough." The court date was set within 2 weeks. Word spread slowly around town that some old guy was challenging Officer Keene. Keene laughed when he got the summons. "Let him try," he told the other officers. "He'll be crying before recess." But the day Elijah walked into that courtroom, dressed again in a suit of quiet power, cane in one hand, leather binder in the other, and head held high, the air shifted. Most didn't recognize him. A few murmured, "That's the guy from the stop sign thing." But no one knew the weight he carried into that room. Keene sat with his usual grin, winking at the bailiff, legs stretched arrogantly. The judge, an older white man named Bradford, called the docket, and the case began. Keene testified first, stating with absolute certainty that Elijah ran the sign, that he behaved argumentatively, and that given the tone and body language, he felt threatened. He said it all smoothly, with practiced ease. Elijah listened quietly, occasionally jotting notes. Then came his turn. He rose slowly, the cane more symbolic than necessary, and greeted the court with a, "Good morning, Your Honor. I'm here to contest the charge and present exonerating evidence." He then requested to place a witness on speakerphone. The judge allowed it. Elijah dialed. "Major Daniels," he said. "This is General Cole. Please proceed." Daniels confirmed the vehicle had a GPS military-grade tracker active during that time frame and had a time-stamped log showing full compliance at the stop sign. "Would you like us to email the record to the clerk?" Daniels asked. "Yes, Major. Send it to the address on file." Elijah hung up, then opened his binder and handed the judge printed images, a sequence of stills from traffic cameras that his legal team had obtained through public records requests, clearly showing the truck at a full stop, the officer watching, then the lights flashing after Elijah had moved forward legally. The courtroom was quiet. The judge reviewed the packet, and Keene's jaw twitched. But before he could protest, the courtroom doors opened. 2 uniformed military officers entered, walking calmly but with purpose, Colonel Reyes and Master Sergeant Hill. They approached the bench and nodded to the judge. "We're here on behalf of General Elijah Cole," Reyes said, "to verify his identity and provide character testimony." Murmurs rippled across the gallery. "General?" Eyes darted toward Elijah. He calmly opened his jacket and revealed his military bars beneath, a wall of service and valor. The judge stood involuntarily. The bailiff rose. One by one, the courtroom followed. The power shifted in an instant. Keene didn't move, frozen. "On your feet, officer," the colonel barked. Keene rose stiffly, and as the entire room stood at attention, the old man with the cane, the man dismissed as just another face, stood taller than anyone. He didn't have to yell, he didn't have to fight. The truth was enough, and justice at last had heard him. The courtroom buzzed with a thick, restless silence in the aftermath of Chapter 1's explosive climax, and when General Elijah Cole left that room with quiet dignity, flanked by the 2 officers who had come not for show but out of reverence, the town of Brookridge was already beginning to feel the ripple effects of what had just unfolded, though most wouldn't fully grasp it until days later. As Elijah stepped into the sunlight beyond the courthouse steps, a small gathering of onlookers, including local reporters and veterans who'd heard rumors of the confrontation, stood waiting in hushed awe, not daring to approach at first, until one young man, a former high school athlete who had floundered after graduation, stepped forward, removed his baseball cap, and said simply, "Sir, thank you," triggering a wave of similar quiet gestures from others in the crowd. Elijah nodded respectfully, said nothing, and walked to his truck. But even as he drove home, the phone calls were beginning. His phone rang, not with congratulations, but with requests, invitations, inquiries. The local news station wanted a statement, several regional papers wanted interviews, and an old friend from D.C. left a voicemail saying, "You just shook up the system down there, Eli. They weren't ready for you." But Elijah ignored most of it, preferring instead to sit at his kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and an open folder containing his personal notes on Officer Darren Keene, notes he'd quietly begun compiling. Not out of vengeance, but because he knew this wasn't just about one traffic stop, and his instincts, forged over decades in intelligence and operations, told him this officer was a symptom of something deeper. So he made a list. Alleged prior. Stops. Civilian complaints quietly dismissed. Remarks overheard by black teenagers on the south side of town, and a string of unfiled incident reports that had never made it past the front desk. And over the next several days, Elijah didn't rest. He got to work. Meanwhile, Officer Keene was unraveling in real time. What had started as a confident smirk had curdled into visible discomfort. He felt the sideways glances at the precinct, the shift in tone when he entered the locker room, and he knew the whispers weren't just about the courtroom. They were about what might come next. Still, he tried to save face, spinning the story to his fellow officers. It was just a misunderstanding. That guy's probably just some ceremonial general. It's all politics. But not everyone bought it, especially not Sergeant Melissa Brandt, a veteran of 20 years on the force who had long distrusted Keene's style of policing and now felt vindicated. She quietly began opening archived files, looking for inconsistencies, and what she found alarmed her. At least 6 cases where traffic stops made by Keene had suspicious overlaps. Black drivers cited for vague reasons, body cam footage mysteriously unavailable, tickets marked as contested and then withdrawn. And she knew then that what General Cole had stirred up was more than a moment. It was a reckoning. Back at Elijah's home, calls came in from other veterans who had faced similar treatment in different jurisdictions, and one call stood out, a 92-year-old Tuskegee airman named Earl Watson who said, "Son, they tried to do that to me too, 3 towns over. They see our skin, not our stripes." And that was all Elijah needed to hear to understand that this battle wasn't going to end in one courtroom. So, with the help of his lawyer, Nadia Lee, he began organizing a formal complaint, compiling testimonies from residents, assembling a timeline of Keene's known misconduct, and quietly reaching out to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. At the same time, Elijah met with Brookridge's chief of police, an aging and politically cautious man named Harold Kemp, who had long tolerated Keene's behavior because of his high arrest numbers, but now found himself under scrutiny. "Chief," Elijah said firmly across the oak conference table in police headquarters, "you've got a rot in your department, and you can either cut it out or wait for it to consume you." Kemp, to his credit, didn't argue. He simply looked tired, then asked, "What do you want from me?" Elijah didn't flinch. "I want transparency, I want reform, and I want Keene off the streets until a full investigation is done." The chief hesitated, but agreed to a temporary administrative leave pending review, which leaked to the press within hours, sparking headlines like "Decorated General Shuts Down Officer with 1 phone call and Bravery Doesn't Retire. Elijah Cole Takes on Brookridge PD." As public pressure mounted, Keene's world shrank. He was confined to desk duty. The media began digging into his past, and what surfaced wasn't pretty. Old Facebook posts with racially charged humor, screenshots of group chats with offensive jokes, and a pattern of professional complaints quietly buried by former supervisors. But what made it all worse was the revelation that Keene had once failed the psychological evaluation required for promotion, a fact sealed in his personnel file, which somehow made its way to a local journalist, likely leaked by someone inside the department who had had enough. Meanwhile, Elijah was asked to speak at the Regional Law Enforcement Academy, where he addressed a room of 50 new recruits in crisp uniforms, all silent as he stood at the podium and said, "Policing is not about control, it's about service. If you think your badge makes you a ruler instead of a protector, take it off now before someone gets hurt." His words, delivered without anger, struck deeper than any shouting could have. One cadet, moved to tears, approached afterward and said, "Sir, I joined because I wanted to help people, but I think I needed to see this to understand how." While Elijah quietly built momentum, Officer Keene's family began to feel the heat. His younger brother was denied a job due to the association, his mother's church group distanced themselves, and even his father, a retired sheriff, called and told him, "Son, You need to make this right." But Keane wasn't ready for remorse. He still saw himself as the victim, blaming cancel culture, blaming the media, blaming everything except his own actions. Still, the pressure mounted, and when he was finally called to testify, in the internal hearing, confronted with his own body cam footage, which had miraculously resurfaced after a technician found the corrupted files intact, it was clear he had lied. The footage didn't just show Elijah stopping, it showed Keane's disrespect, his tone, his body language, and it was irrefutable. Within 72 hours, Keane was placed on indefinite suspension without pay, pending termination proceedings. Elijah, however, didn't celebrate. Instead, he met with the mayor and proposed a new initiative, Veterans in Leadership, a program that would place retired military leaders in mentorship roles across local schools, police departments, and community programs. The mayor agreed, and within weeks Elijah was coordinating citywide seminars, including one specifically for local law enforcement on recognizing unconscious bias, de-escalation, and the power of respect. But the most powerful moment came during one of those sessions when a black high schooler named Tyrese stood up and said, "I thought being black meant I'd always be seen as a threat, but now I see what strength really looks like," and looked straight at Elijah. The general walked forward, placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and replied, "They can judge your skin, son, but never let them judge your spirit." And so as the chapter closed, the town of Brookridge found itself changed. Not overnight, not entirely, but undeniably. And at the center of it all stood the man they once dismissed as just another elderly black man with a cane, who in truth was a warrior still fighting, not with weapons but with wisdom, clarity, and the unwavering belief that justice was not a relic of the past, but a responsibility of the present. By the time the town council convened in an emergency closed-door session to address the growing unrest in Brookridge, General Elijah Cole had already become more than a name. He had become a symbol, not of retaliation, but of responsibility. And while many still underestimated the depth of the movement unfolding around him, those closest to the flame could feel the intensity rising as more voices, previously silenced by fear or futility, began stepping forward with stories that, when viewed alone, may have seemed anecdotal, but together painted a disturbing portrait of a pattern too insidious to ignore. Young black men and women, elders, veterans, immigrants, and even a few former officers all began contributing their experiences to Elijah's compiled report, now a full dossier marked with the insignia of the U.S. Department of Justice and flagged for federal review, not merely an indictment of Officer Keane, but a detailed exposé of a culture of complicity that had grown roots in Brookridge law enforcement and municipal government for years. Yet, amid the growing scrutiny, not everyone embraced the changes Elijah's momentum threatened to impose. A faction within the police department, including a few of Keane's longtime allies, began to organize pushback, some under the guise of procedural defense, others more brazenly defensive of the status quo, their rhetoric laced with the same coded language Elijah had heard for decades. "He's trying to change how we do things. This town doesn't need outside interference. They're making it about race when it's really about order." But Elijah didn't flinch, because he'd heard these refrains before in jungles, deserts, and boardrooms, from men in suits and soldiers in armor, and he knew that beneath those defensive postures was fear, not of chaos, but of accountability. As local media continued coverage of the unfolding scandal, the national spotlight soon followed. A CNN segment highlighted Elijah's courtroom encounter, while a viral social media post captioned, "The old man who made the whole court stand," amassed millions of views, prompting military veterans from across the country to share similar stories under the hashtag #RespectTheUniform, many of them black, brown, and often overlooked, their voices now echoing into a space Elijah had helped carve open. Meanwhile, Elijah was invited to Washington, D.C. to brief a congressional subcommittee on racial bias and veteran rights in civilian settings, but he declined, instead forwarding Sergeant Melissa Brandt as a witness to internal practices, and she testified with brutal honesty, stating under oath that "We were told not to rock the boat, but the boat was already sinking under the weight of bad policy and unchecked prejudice." Her words, broadcast live, reverberated back home. where Chief Harold Kemp found himself cornered politically, and in a desperate attempt to save face, he announced a department-wide audit and a temporary community oversight board, which Elijah agreed to join only on the condition that it holds subpoena power and public transparency. As the structural shifts began, the social backlash intensified. Pro-Keene protesters, mostly from the surrounding suburbs, organized a rally calling for law and order, brandishing flags and slogans that barely veiled their resentment, while a parallel counter-rally, organized by local youth and veterans, coalitions remained peaceful yet resolute, culminating in a moment where Elijah stepped onto the courthouse steps once more, not to confront, but to speak. "This isn't about revenge," he said into a megaphone. "It's about a promise. A promise that the uniform I wore and the oath I took meant something, not just overseas but right here at home." His words, calm and uncompromising, silenced even the loudest hecklers for a moment, and though a few scoffed and turned away, many more listened, and some even lowered their signs. Back in his home, Elijah reviewed letters from children, former soldiers, and strangers. One stood out from a teenage girl named Annika, who wrote, "I didn't know we had heroes like you anymore. Now I want to serve too, not just to protect people, but to do it right." He kept her letter folded in his coat pocket after that. Still, not all battles were public. Some unfolded in private rooms and shadowed corners, and Elijah knew the deeper resistance would come not from the angry few but from the comfortable many, those who preferred quiet injustice to loud correction. And it was one such figure, Deputy Mayor Charles Greeley, who met Elijah behind closed doors and tried to broker a truce. "General," he said smoothly, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "maybe it's time to ease off. The gas pedal, let the system work things out. We don't need more division." Elijah leaned forward, his voice low but piercing. "You're not afraid of division, Charles. You're afraid of exposure, and I won't trade justice for your comfort." Greeley's expression faltered, and though he left the meeting still in power, the tide had already turned against him. Within days, a leaked email revealed he'd shielded Keene from a previous suspension, and public outcry forced his resignation. Elijah, meanwhile, continued building his coalition. He recruited local teachers, civic leaders, ministers, and yes, even a few repentant officers, into what became known as the Brookridge Unity Forum, a grassroots initiative for community restoration and training programs for public servants. Funding came from an unexpected source, a retired tech mogul and Army veteran named Jamal Watkins, who'd seen Elijah's story and offered support, saying, "Men like you laid the foundation for everything I built. This is the least I can do." With a grant of $500,000 and logistical backing, Elijah launched a year-long pilot program across 3 precincts and 5 schools, combining history education, bias training, and veteran mentorship, and early feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Yet for all this momentum, one person remained in the shadows, spiraling: Darren Keene. Stripped of his badge, his public persona shattered, and his appeals denied, he found himself alone, bitter, and teetering on the edge of collapse. A local reporter confronted him outside a store, asking, "Do you regret how you handled that traffic stop?" And Keene, red-eyed and visibly trembling, muttered, "I don't know anymore. He broke me." But it wasn't Elijah who had broken him. It was truth, long denied, now unavoidable. As Elijah prepared for the town's first Unity Forum summit, hosted in the same courthouse where it all began, he walked the halls with quiet confidence, not seeking applause, but determined to ensure that the changes wouldn't fade once the headlines did. When he stepped onto the stage beside decorated veterans, student leaders, and yes, even a few officers in new uniforms, he paused, scanned the room and said, "They thought I was just an old man with a cane. But what they didn't understand is that we don't stop fighting just because we hang up the uniform. We don't forget our mission just because we return home. Justice isn't a memory. It's a duty. And I will carry it until my last breath." The crowd rose, not in politeness but in respect, and among them stood a young boy in ROTC dress blues, saluting with tears in his eyes, and Elijah returned it, one hand on his cane, the other raised in a solemn, timeless gesture of service. Returned. And thus Chapter 3 drew to a close, not with a final triumph, but with the resilient heartbeat of a community rediscovering its courage, one truth at a time. The day the Justice Department officially launched its investigation into systemic misconduct in Brookridge's police department, the town that had once ignored the quiet warnings of its elders found itself holding its collective breath, and, as General Elijah Cole walked past the familiar rust-red brick of the courthouse toward a press conference now drawing national media, he didn't see a place of shame. He saw a place of reckoning, not just for the officers who had laughed at his presence or the officials who once denied his standing, but for every institution that had allowed silence to masquerade as peace and fear to stand in for order. The summit he had helped initiate had evolved into a full-fledged initiative now dubbed Project Resilience, a multi-agency task force combining civic education, police reform training, and military veteran mentorship across multiple cities. Beyond Brookridge, and Elijah, once mocked as a relic, now served as its honorary chairman. Though he insisted on doing the grunt work, traveling, speaking at schools, sitting down with angry young men and skeptical officers alike to say not, "I told you so, but let's build something better." His days became a tapestry of late-night calls with senators, morning visits to detention centers, where he met youths arrested on the same streets he'd once walked as a young cadet, and weekend gatherings with families looking for answers, for protection, for hope. But even as the light of reform began pushing back the shadows, those shadows fought back. A group of fired officers, some embittered and others radicalized, launched an anonymous podcast attacking the reforms, calling them anti-cop and un-American, drawing attention from fringe networks and stirring unrest in nearby counties. Threats began to trickle in, letters with no return addresses, calls in the dead of night, whispers at gas stations. But Elijah did not flinch, and when asked by a reporter whether he feared retaliation, he said simply, "I've faced real enemies. Cowards with microphones don't scare me." Still, law enforcement took the threat seriously, and a special protection detail was assigned to Elijah, one he reluctantly accepted only after it was made clear that the same people threatening him were also targeting school board members and reform advocates. Meanwhile, Darren Keene remained confined by both legal consequence and public disgrace. He attempted to reinvent himself as a victim, giving exclusive interviews to sympathetic podcasts and issuing a half-hearted apology that quickly unraveled when documents emerged showing he had falsified 2 separate arrest reports in the past. His supporters dwindled, and in a final attempt at relevance, he tried to sue the city for wrongful termination, only to have the case summarily dismissed when overwhelming evidence of his misconduct was entered into record, including body cam, footage that had conveniently been lost, but was recovered by a tech forensics unit Elijah had helped coordinate. The footage showed Keene bragging to another officer, "You see that old man? I'll have him in cuffs just for sport," followed by a smirk that would become the thumbnail image in every news outlet reporting on his downfall. Meanwhile, Elijah returned to the courtroom, not as a defendant or witness, but as a keynote speaker at a judicial reform panel hosted by the State Bar Association, where he told a room full of judges and prosecutors, "Justice begins not in your verdicts, but in your vision. If you can't see dignity in the man before you, you will never deliver fairness after him." His words prompted a standing ovation, and among the crowd was the very judge who once presided over his case, a man who, now humbled and publicly regretful, approached Elijah afterward, shook his hand, and said, "I was wrong. I saw your skin before I saw your stars." Elijah, never one to gloat, simply replied, "Just don't make that mistake again for anyone." At home, Elijah's quiet life had become a revolving door of visitors, students writing papers, journalists seeking interviews, veterans thanking him for making them visible again. His porch became a symbol, his cane a marker, and his presence a reminder that change could come even when the world assumed you were finished. On a warm summer evening, as fireflies blinked across his lawn and jazz filtered softly from the radio, Elijah sat with his daughter Maya and his grandson Malik, who asked, "Grandpa, why did they treat you like you weren't a hero?" Elijah smiled, not bitterly but knowingly, and said, "Because sometimes people confuse silence with consent, and sometimes they don't see you until you speak loud enough to shake the room." That fall, A statue was erected outside the Brookridge Civic Center, not of Elijah at his insistence, but of a nameless soldier standing tall with a raised fist and a folded constitution in the other hand, inscribed with the words, "Service never ends." At the unveiling ceremony, attended by thousands, Maya delivered the keynote. "My father didn't just fight wars abroad. He fought them here in courtrooms and town halls and sidewalks, not with violence, but with truth. And because of him, Brookridge remembers." The crowd erupted in applause, and somewhere among them a child asked his mother, "Was that the old man the cops laughed at?" And she answered, "Yes, and they're not laughing now." Project Resilience continued to grow, with cities from Georgia to Michigan replicating the Brookridge model, and Elijah became a consultant for federal programs on veteran re-entry and racial equity, though he often deflected praise, saying, "This isn't about me, it's about never letting another uniform be disrespected, dismissed, or dishonored again." In his final public speech, delivered at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., he stood beneath portraits of Tuskegee Airmen and Buffalo soldiers and said, "We have always fought for a country that didn't always fight for us. But we didn't do it for applause. We did it so that one day a black veteran could walk into a courtroom and not be laughed at, but heard." The room fell silent, then stood in reverent unison. And in that moment, the story came full circle, not with revenge but with restoration, not with fear but with fire, not with the image of an old man in uniform, mocked by arrogance, but with the enduring truth that no one is ever too old, too quiet, or too overlooked to start a revolution of respect. General Elijah Cole would never call himself a hero, but for a nation that saw itself through his unshakable dignity, he became exactly that.